begala, wangi susala, wati kalala, ulo bubelena.
Wangi begala,
wangi tatala, wangi begala, wangi susala, wati kalala, ulo bubelena.
ulo bubelena mi.
Ujesulo no bubelena, ujesulo no bubelena, ulo bubelena.
Kwaze kwa bonakala tina sofana naye. Kwaze
kwa bonakala tina sofana naye.
Kwaze
kwa bonakala tina sofana naye.
tina
Sofana naye, tina sofana naye,
tina
sofana naye, tina sofana naye.
Kwaze
Kwa bonakala tina sofana naye.
kwaze
Kwa bonakala tina sofana naye.
tina
Sofana naye, tina sofana naye.
tina
Sofana naye, tina sofana naye.
When he comes
When he comes, I shall be like him.
when he comes
When he comes, I shall be like him.
oh
Oh,
oh
oh,
oh
oh, like him.
no more pain
No more pain, I shall be like him.
see his face
See his face, I shall be like him.
oh
Oh,
oh
oh, oh, like him.
no more pain
No more pain, I shall be like him.
no more pain
No more pain, I shall be like him.
oh
Oh,
oh
oh, oh, like him.
Kwaze
Bonakala, tina sofana naye.
kwaze
Bonakala, tina sofana naye.
tina
Sofana naye, tina sofana naye.
tina
Sofana naye, tina sofana naye. Sigeleli Africa, malupaka Yesu pondoloyo, Israeli mitandazo yetu, kosi sigelela tina lusapolwayo. Mungu ibariki Afrika, wabariki viongozi wake, hekima, umoja na amani. Hizi ni ngao zetu Afrika na watu wake, kosi sigeleli Afrika, malupaka Yesu pondolwayo, Israeli mitandazo yetu, kosi sigelela tina lusapolwayo. Woza moya, woza moya, woza moya, woza moya, woza moya, oh ingwele, usi sikelele tina lusapolwayo. Morena boloka se chama sa Yesu, ofendi se ditwate machwenyeho. Morena boloka se chama sa Yesu,
Diamond Jubilee is an opportune time for us to take stock through the lens of Pan-Africanism, which is our running theme for this conference, which is an ever-enduring prism through which we can engage and exchange with one another. We also saw it as an opportune time to come together with the African Studies Center, given that the center was established only in the mid-2000s, but much of the foundational work for the establishment of the African Studies Center was certainly the presence of the Africa Society. In the same vein, we also recognize that there's mushrooming of interest, if you want, within the university as it relates to Oxford, and also appreciate the initiative known as the Africa-Oxford Initiative that was recently established to build collaborations between African researchers, academics, and so forth, and Oxford. I will now hand over to the brainchild, really, of the 60th anniversary, our Secretary General, Temi Tope, who has been heading together with a committee every aspect of putting together this conference, and perhaps without prematurely sounding the trumpet of success, I think they've done an excellent job in terms of the speakers who will be here, the programming, the material that they've been able to gather together and arrange for our engagement. And Temi will introduce the 60th anniversary, our program for today, and guide us through the afternoon. And I'm grateful for your attention, and thank you very much for being here with us today.
Hello, so before I speak, we need, there's more music, so Ingoni and Kristen. will play a piece for us.
I'm from Zimbabwe. Today I'll be playing the Mbira with vocals from Kristen. We are playing a song named Wonto. That's a Shona word for war, or you can translate it to struggle. And I think it's a fitting song for this event because we are here partly because of the struggles we've had to go through as the African continent, as the society here at Oxford. So enjoy.
Just a few notes of welcome and thank you, because there are many people I think I feel the obligation to thank for the opportunity of hosting this event today. So I started working on events related to this anniversary back in September 2017. Then I thought I would just do a few introspectives for Black History Month into the history of the society. So I must really thank the people I reached out to, then who responded with enthusiasm. In particular, Professor Wendy James and her husband Douglas Johnson, whose generosity was unparalleled, and Professor William Beinart, who connected me to many of the key figures of the African Society and the African Studies Center. like Justin Pierce, whose essay, Africans in Oxford, I've used for the posters. Both Professor Bernard and Professor James were senior members of the society, and so was Dr. Phyllis Ferguson, who is with us today. And that's Professor Kalia Watershed. I will mention that later. So, Dr. Phyllis joined us around December last year to start working on the anniversary project. She's always done for us more than we asked and more than we could ever ask. Continuing on the line of our senior members, we are grateful to Professor Wale Adebangwe and the administrators of African Studies, in particular Julia Constantinescu, for mediating with the college, the St. Antony's College for us, and carrying out our often late request. We must also thank late Professor Raufu Mustapha, who left us recently. He infused new energies into the society as a staff member in the 90s and helped it become what it is today. I am grateful to the archivists and the development officers of the colleges who responded to our appeals, some going well beyond their duty to help us. A special note of gratitude goes to the Antony Fund, which chose to sponsor our event when very little of it was yet visible. We appreciate your trust and hope you to satisfy today. We must also thank the college warden, Professor Goodman, for responding clearly to our request, and Ms. Birgit Sotis for patience in dealing with us. Another note of gratitude goes to the Ghana High Commission in London and Brazil for sponsoring Ambassador Busia's visits. This confirms once again the central goal of Ghana as a political laboratory for Africa and a main engine of Pan-Africanism. Our third major sponsor and a close collaborator of the African Society is the African Oxford Initiative, who selflessly provided us with everything we were missing to complete this project. One final, I should also mention Sentence College, whose principal is Austin Professor Ambassador Busia, and she will be here after the break. One final thank you goes to Dr. Luis Intenda, who is in Japan right now. He couldn't be here today, but has contributed majorly to this event with information, names, and photographs. Finally, we thank and once more we welcome all of you who responded to our invitations and agreed with us by being here today that this occasion is worthy of a celebration. I must, however, single out a few of you. So, in particular, I think Njodi has already mentioned, we welcome Ms. Pamela Roberts, who gave a lecture in the lifetime on Christian Cole, the first non-black students to have graduated from Oxford. That lecture and the following conversation with Professor Wale Adebangwe further motivated us to continue our archive research. And on the other side of the publishing industry, we welcome Ms. Nana Ayibia Clark, an African publisher and a publisher of African books, whose contributions have been recognized with a membership to the Order of the British Empire. We welcome all of our former members, and in particular, Mr. Kisanga Chekwe, President in 1978, is currently in the city, but unfortunately I think is not with us today. Mr. Stephen Gawe, who was president in 1968. We will try to meet him later today. We also want to remember those who are not with us today. So I'm thinking in particular of Stefan Peshaman-Koy, who was president in 1965. He passed away very young in 1968, not before living and indelible mark in the people he met in Oxford and in Congo. His daughter Erika is here today. I am also thinking of Tajuddin Abdul Rahim, president in 1988 and between 1988 and 1999, which especially we want to remember today because both because a week ago was Africa Day, the day Africans have chosen for themselves to celebrate Pan-Africanism and the African Union. And because in the same day, 9 years ago, he died in a car crash in Nairobi. So I'm sorry if I brought you to my long list, but I think it was needed, and I hope I have not left anyone out. If I have, it's because of my forgetfulness, not because we didn't value your contributions. So if it seems that half of the room has contributed to this event in one way or the other, it's because that was the case. And I'm sure the other half will catch up before the afternoon ends. Now with 2 pieces of information for the end, for later in the afternoon. So we've been a bit confusing with the food arrangements. So there will be food, and it will be at Simukai College about at 7 p.m. It's starting, and we thank our social secretaries, in particular Nada Kudi, for organizing this in with really short notice. And one other piece of information is because of visa issues, Professor Omotosho couldn't be physically with us today, but he's following on Skype. Maybe he can say hello.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah. I think this is everything I needed to say, and I will pass on the microphone to our first speaker, Dr. Tunde Oseni. Okay. So Dr. Tunde is the head of the Department of International Relations in the University of Ibadan, and is very generously offered to come, sponsored by his university, to our event today, and will speak on Pan-Africanism in the age of globalization. So I should also mention that Professor Dr. Tunde Oseni was a student here in the MSc program 10 years ago. And so we hope this feels like coming back home. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to be here today, to be invited by the Oxford Africa Society. And of course, I'm also glad that I'll be sharing this platform with some other highly recognized global scholars like Professor Wale Adebanwi, Professor Kwale Montosho, Professor Abena Busia, Professor Patricia Daley, and Professor Simukai Chigudu. My intervention at this meeting is basically to look into 2 concepts, or rather 2 ideas: Pan-Africanism and globalization. You'll agree with me that Pan-Africanism as an ideal is more ideal than being real, whereas globalization is more real than being ideal. So I want to see how we can bridge the gap between these 2 ideas, or ideas. So we can also describe Pan-Africanism as global Africa idea, and globalization as liberal global idea. Rooted in the thoughts and actions of Pan-Africanists, such as Marcus Garvey, George Padmore, W. Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Obafemi Awolowo, Thabo Mbeki, among others. Pan-Africanism hinges on the possibility of rediscovery of the African person as a complete human being who is capable of making scientific discovery, innovation, and contributing to human development. As a continent with a range of internal, structural, existential, and external dimensions, Africa could be assessed based on Pan-Africanism as an intellectual ideology within the framework of globalization. The thrust of my presentation today is to examine the idealist postulations of Pan-Africanism within the context of what the continent, I mean the African continent, can do and what it does contribute in the new age of globalization. And we should note that we have old Pan-Africanism, new Pan-Africanism, old globalization, new globalization, and of course, we can also talk about homeland Pan-Africanism and diaspora Pan-Africanism. This will be clear very soon. As a liberal idea, globalization assumes, and sometimes rightly so, that the countries and continents of the world can make equally beneficial and positive contributions to the growth, integration, and development of the world system. The gap between what is idealized for the global system, that is globalization, and what is idealized for a continent, Pan-Africanism, is more likely to be filled with extrapolations that take both historical and contemporary realities into consideration. This paper attempts to further dissect the progression and regression of Pan-Africanism as a continental idea. And I know Professor Kwale is going to be talking about the rise and the decline and rise of Pan-Africanism. I would rather also talk about the rise, decline, and rise of Pan-Africanism. Some questions need to be asked. What cultural values has Africa added to the globalizing world? What political formulas and models have or can Africa contribute to the global search for social justice and democratic practice? If the West and the East were to deny the world in general, and Africa in particular, their technologies and epistemic values, what innovative and sustainable ideas would Pan-Africanism inject into African persons as inventors and problem solvers? To the extent that globalization is more real than ideal, and Pan-Africanism is more ideal than real, our intervention is a needful explanation of the African conditions in the imperative reconciliation of the two ideas. So in essence, what I want to say, or rather propose, is that there is a need to strike a balance between the global Africa idea, Pan-Africanism, and the liberal global idea, globalization. Maybe we can have something like sustainable global idea, which is going to promote a more inclusive integration, development, and prosperity, not only for Africa, but across the world. According to Toyin Falola and Kwame Essien, Pan-Africanism broadly refers to the idea that people of African descent share similar histories and struggles, a common destiny, and processes for forming cross-cultural unity in areas of history, politics, and economics. No doubt, as Falola and Essien explicate, there's a need to rejuvenate the ideals of the Europe, Black internationalism. We can also talk about Black intellectualism. The very idea of diasporic intellectualization of the humanhood and the centrality of the liberation struggle against slavery, colonialism, segregation, and apartheid. My paper borrows from Falola and Essien's thesis, which calls for appropriation and performance of Pan-Africanism on continental, national, regional, local, and transatlantic levels. The Pan-African ideology, or what we can call the global Africa idea, shares epistemological semblance and, of course, substance with what Achimafeji calls Africanity, namely a sense of recognition of the Africanness of the African, the essence of being an African. As it is, Africanity has profound political, ideological, cosmological, and intellectual implications. It is within the context of Africanizing or Pan-Africanizing that we seek to make argument for the globalization of Pan-African thoughts and ideas, as well as Pan-Africanization of global ideas. Essentially, the objective of this contribution largely rests upon the assumption that Pan-Africanism needs to be rejigged for global relevance. We seek to interrogate the multidimensionality of Africanity, and much more importantly, the global Africa idea of development. To this end, we must distinguish between Pan-Africanism as an idea and Pan-Africanism as a movement, as well as, succinctly put it, Pan-Africanism sees African people and those of African descent as searching for liberation, and as a result of common experiences, the quest for freedom, united against a common enemy. More important, as a unit, it worked together to bring about independence and human dignity. Pan-Africanism as an idea is a language of liberation. As a movement, it is the cultural and political attempt to take back humanhood, nationhood, and culture to rebuild and revitalize cultural identity in the New World and within Africa. On the other hand, globalization is both an idea and a process. It connotes the idea of a global village in which people of the world now live in a borderless entity, as shaped by transnational activities of political, economic, social, and technological nature. And when we talk about integration, development, prosperity, whether from Pan-Africanist perspective or globalist perspective, we should also add epistemological context. And I'm going to talk briefly about that very soon. Nevertheless, the 21st century, or the new age of globalization, we contend, needs to be explored much more innovatively by Africans, Africanists, and Friends of Africa in accommodating Pan-Africanism as a way of globalizing it. In our thinking, that is my thinking, two key issues should inform such exploration of the potential pathways. One, Africans must not obsess with the past. Challenges of the new age of globalization must be tackled with both local and global ideas. Two, Africans both at homeland and in diaspora must be ready to globalize the Pan-African and Pan-Africanize the global. For clarity, my first assumption does not negate or downplay the epochal nature of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and apartheid, as the case may be. The point is more of the need to look into the future. That is called Afrofuturism. By concentrating on the realities of the present, that is Afro-realism. There's no doubt that the long-lasting effects of the trauma of the past still loom large on the political economy of Africa. Such historically entrenched limitations are better dealt with decisively, firstly internally, and whenever possible externally. Of course, Africa is not a country. There are different dimensions of development across the continent of Africa, but there are some things that we can borrow from countries like Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew. What did he do? He borrowed Western ideas, mixed it up with his own local solutions, and was able to transform Singapore from a third world country to a first world country. Similarly, the time is now for the globalization of diaspora Pan-Africanism, along with what we call the homeland Pan-Africanism. Development happens when those in charge understand and explore both internal and external solutions to problems. We contend that a cocktail of internally generated development ideas, what I call IGDIs, and externally received development ideas, ERDIs, is needed for Africa to leapfrog into the future. If these two premises are taken into context, our intervention will be made more meaningful, reconciling the two ideas. Pan-Africanism and globalization are two ideas. While Pan-Africanism is dwindling, regressing, receding, and needs a recalibration for developmental agenda for Africa, globalization is waxing stronger and getting much more promoted as the global ideal. There, however, exists an intricate relationship between the two ideas, which is to say the least at times could be parasitic, because if the globe is developing and Africa is regressing, then it is parasitic. But if the globe is moving forward and Africa is moving forward, then it becomes symbiotic. Since Pan-Africanism seeks to liberate Africans and their diaspora counterparts across the world, and in the new age developed there, any negative consequences of globalization will spell a doom for the global Africa idea. As Stiglitz 2002 coherently argued, failure of development in Africa was due to neoliberal economic policies foisted on Africa by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Neoliberalism is economic westernization, no doubt, and globalization. To this end, to reconcile the two ideas and ideals is to advocate that Pan-African ideology, or the global Africa idea, namely Pan-Africanism, must be equally globalized, must be mainstreamed into what we know as economic globalization. At the epistemological level, it must be emphasized that Pan-African knowledge production be made global. While Pan-Africanism is often seen as a continental ideal, actually it's an intercontinental ideal. Because if you look at the African-American origin of Pan-Africanism, it is actually an intercontinental ideal. It is not just for Africans and Africanists or Friends of Africa, but also Africanists and Africanists in the rest of the world. In this sense, Pan-Africanist struggles of the last century, as well as the psychological confidence it birthed, can be a standing pillar and springboard for sustainable development in much of Africa. The crossbreed of indigenous African knowledge and relevant Western ideas to be promoted and domesticated for developmental purposes, And I'm going to pause here to say something about the epistemological contributions of two people, Ache Mafeje and Tony Falola. Mafeje talks about Africanity, the essence of being an African. And Falola talks about universality, talking about methodological multiplicity of knowledges, whether arts or sciences or anything in between. If we are trying to globalize, we must also try to globalize only, inclusive globalization, particularly at the epistemological level. The epistemic values of these ideas must not be lost. In this regard, scholars in Africa should invest time and energy, of course with their diasporic counterparts, supported with funding by government and organized private sector, in reaching out to their diaspora colleagues in formulating research and development ideas for government and people back at home. And of course, in producing ideas that can uplift the epistemic values of African origins. At the economic level, and following the Stiglitzan logic that externally imposed measures don't work, but rather hurt African economies, Pan-African approach must be devised to rescue the continent. Pan-African economic ideas could and should be infused into the mainstream development economies. In this regard, Tony Elumelu's concept of Africapitalism could be explored for the relevance of Pan-Africanism on a global scale. Specifically, Africapitalism is the economic philosophy that the African private sector has the power to transform the continent through long-term investments, creating both economic prosperity and social wealth. While such an Afrocentric entrepreneurship model might sound romantic and extremely optimistic, it indeed offers a fresh Pan-African outlook into the development of Africa. In the new age of globalization, and when we talk about new age of globalization, we're probably talking about 3 decades from now, particularly with internet revolution from ARPANET to internet. Economic liberation and development is as much as important as the mental political liberation of the past. At the geopolitical level, including social cohesion of the African people, African leaders and those in diaspora must work out autochthonous political models that can be sustained for development. It should not be a matter of binary choice between democracy and development, presidentialism and parliamentarism. There should be some ideas that are of African origin, of Pan-Africanist origin. It shouldn't be a binary choice between capitalism or socialism, Washington consensus or Beijing consensus. Authentic African ideas, which have worked in the past, could be resuscitated, fine-tuned, and recontextualized for developmental agenda across the continent. Furthermore, solidarity across the continent must explore globalist migration models rather than protectionist or restrictive approach of stringent visa regimes. The African Union must be more strengthened and proactive in tackling centrifugal tendencies that inhibit African unity. To be relevant at the global level, Africa must be united at home. Because when you say African Union modeled after European Union, of course, there are some issues with the Brexit and all that. But for the most part, if a member of African Union is citizen of the European Union, you don't need visa, I think. But in Africa, it's not like that. Except from regional considerations like ECOWAS and SADC, among others. To be relevant at the global level, Africa must be united at home, and for unity to be extended abroad, the global Africa idea, namely Pan-Africanism, will have to be globalized. In this sense, African Union's new partnership for development in the PAD will have to be resuscitated. At the cultural level, efforts must be made to globalize authentic and developmental values of African origins. And I was actually impressed by the Oxford African Choir because what they did was fantastic. They Pan-Africanized the global and globalized the Pan-African at the social, cultural, and religious level. African philosophies and cultural concepts, such as Ubuntu for the Zulu and Omoluabi Yoruba, for instance, should be globally popularized. It has been observed that much of the conflict ravaging Africa, from ethnic wars to terrorism, have been due to resource costs or some other opportunistic tendencies. But certain conflicts, such as land disputes, herdsmen crises, and electoral violence, can be prevented and managed with tested Pan-African cultural methods. I'm also impressed by what happened in Kenya just 2 days ago between President Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga. That is the essence of Ubuntu. Ubuntu means I am because we have. Ubuntu and Omolabi concept, for instance, emphasize the communal nature of Africans and tend to make individuals think and act beyond material, personal, and instrumental gains, thereby reducing tendencies for conflictual dealings. If properly harnessed, such cultural elements can be the African contribution to the globalization of peace and conflict resolution, negotiation, conciliation, mediation. All these are already inherently, embedded in some African countries. At all levels, Pan-Africanism must not be instrumentalized for otherization. She shouldn't be where Africans, there are others. No, because in the age of globalization, you need others even to exist. That is Ubuntu. Ubuntu does not just say that I'm Zulu, Xhosa, we are together. No, I'm Yoruba, I'm Igbo, I'm Hausa, I'm Kikuyu. She's British, she's English. We all belong to the human race. That is what Ubuntu preaches. And if globalization is to take it to that level, we have to also globalize the Pan-Africanist tendencies for such globalization efforts. Africa is a continent and not a country. It consists of diverse people with similar but distinct traits. Globalization of migration and highly paced communication technology of the extant century has equally widened the categories within which Africans in homeland and diaspora might be grouped. This further suggests that Pan-Africanism cannot go beyond its hitherto Afro-American roots to traverse into the rest of the world, including Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Nevertheless, an Afro-realist as opposed to Afro-pessimist approach to the capability of the stakeholders to enact Pan-Africanism or the global Africa idea to maximize development in the continent shows certain challenges. You have a lack of political will, technological backwardness, at least in comparative terms, perpetual asymmetrical global political economy, which leads to Africa. To counteract these challenges, a new life needs to be injected into Pan-Africanism, both as an idea and as a movement. The old Pan-Africanism was used to get liberation from the variant of the old globalization, including slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. The new Pan-Africanism must demand development against the odds of the new globalization, including modern slavery, uneven wealth distribution, technological divide, and global geopolitical manipulation of the marginalized peoples of the world by countries that are powerful. Normatively, this will be largely done by Africa's youthful population, more than 300 million, with their counterparts spread across the world. Technology will play a large role, and the growing social media networks will be explored to take Pan-African ideology to the next level in the new age of globalization. I conclude by saying that whether we have Pan-Africanized globalization or globalized Pan-Africanism, we are not boxed into one corner. Either way, Africans and Pan-Africanists gain, and the world gains too.
Next, we are welcoming Professor Patricia Daley, who is a professor in the Department of Geography here in Oxford, and is one of our former members, secretary in the late 80s. Professor Patricia Daley is currently a tutor in Jesus College, where she's more specifically she's an L. tutor of geography, and her research focuses on the human geography of Africa. So she will be giving a talk today now about experiences as an African and a diasporic African scholar in Oxford.
I think the tempo will be slightly different from the previous excellent paper we've just listened to. I'd just like to congratulate the Africa Society for reaching its 60th anniversary and the current committee for organizing this celebration. At one time in the 1990s, when the number of African students coming to Oxford fell below the 1980s level, I thought the society was going to perish. And I'm glad to see it is now a significant force in activities pertaining to Africa in the university. I've been asked to reflect on my time in the society and how it has impacted on my career. And I'm going to do so by talking about this person up here, but I'll come to that later. I arrived in Oxford as a doctoral student in 1985. The Africa Society provided a base for me, what we would term today a safe space. For 1 year, I think, or it might be just less, I was secretary of the society. Through my interactions with the African students coming directly from the continent, I went through a process of unlearning and relearning and deep conscientization. I unlearned my master's degree in African Studies from SOAS through an introduction to writings by progressive African scholars. My political consciousness deepened, and so did my involvement in anti-apartheid activities, in particular the Save the Sharpeville 6 campaign. My exposure to new Africa-centered debates and knowledges from the continent changed my perception forever about what African scholarship should be. And I should say, actually, I'm of Caribbean descent, born in Jamaica, grew up in East London. In the 1980s, there were two societies that catered specifically for students of African descent: the Caribbean Society and the Africa Society. Sorry. I want to ask well, I can carry on while he's doing it. So there were two societies for students of African descent. The Caribbean Society and the Africa Society. The Caribbean Society comprised of students coming directly from the Caribbean, whilst the Africa Society was for students interested in Africa, though not necessarily of African descent. As a British black person of Caribbean and African ancestry doing research on Africa, Africa Society was my natural home. I had little to do with the Caribbean students who were made up of light-skinned members of the Caribbean elite who continued their practice of colorism whilst in Oxford. Africa Society was diverse in its membership, students from the continent's traditional elite, nouveau riche, white South Africans and Zimbabweans, as well as extraordinarily talented students from humble backgrounds. And I think in particular of Tajuddin Abdul Rahim, Yakubu Aliyu, and Raufu Mustapha. During that period, those of us of African descent pushed to ensure that the officers of the society were black Africans, since it was clear to us that the society provided an alternative space to the scholarship on Africa that we experienced in the formal university seminars and events. Africa Society retained its inclusivity and thrived on a Pan-African outlook, accepting Africans irrespective of their philosophical views and political leanings. As a British Caribbean researcher working in Africa, I felt I had something to contribute to the debates on the continent, conditions and futures. At the time, there was no African Caribbean society, as there is now, catering for the few black British students who were here. We were comfortable situating ourselves within African society because it embraced a Pan-African outlook. A key member of the society and a promoter of Pan-Africanism was the president of the Africa Society in the late 80s, Tajuddin Abdul Rahim. And I'm going to look at the issue of diaspora scholarship and inclusivity by talking about the life of Tajuddin Abdul Rahim. So I'm going to show you, in a sense, present some of his ideas about Pan-Africanism. Now, some of you, as you will have already heard, Tajuddin died on the 25th of May 2009 in a car crash in Kenya. And there are lots of tributes up. Most of them were on a website known as, and a newsletter called Pamazooka News. It was a tragedy for many who knew him. Sorry, let me, yeah. Tajudeen was born in the northern Nigerian town of Funtua and studied at Bayero University in Kano before joining Oxford University in 1983 as a Rhodes Scholar to pursue a doctorate on the supervision of the political scientist Gavin Williams. During his time here, Tajudeen was the president, of the Africa Society and the Africa branch of the Sabus Sharpeville 6 campaign. He was a member of the editorial board of the Journal of African Marxists, and he later moved to London to work for the Institute of African Alternatives. Taj rose to prominence, as I'll show later, as the Secretary General of the Pan-African Movement, an organizer of the 7th Pan-African Congress, which was held in Uganda in April 1994. So as far as Pan-Africanism and its relationship with the Africa Society here, Taju was key. At the time of his death, Taju was contracted as a Deputy Director of the United Nations Millennium Development Campaign. Yet he was not mainstreamed. He was a fighter in the struggle to get the campaign to support meaningful programs to improve the lives of African people. He was also the chairperson of a number of Pan-African social justice organizations. So, for example, he was co-chair with Alex de Waal of the Center for Democracy and Development. He was chair of the Pan-African Development Education and Advocacy Program, PADEP. And he had, even in his hometown, I'll show a photo later, he set up a memorial college in honor of his mother, who died at the age of 40. And he personally funded, when he died, we found out that he personally funded the education of numerous school and university students across the African continent, wherever he lived. Taju, even when he was at Oxford, Taju was famous actually for his postcards, which I'll come to later. But when he was at Oxford, he was a mobilizer, but he was also very inclusive. Right? And when he died, many people wrote tributes on the Pamazooka News website. But looking through them, one in particular struck me. And this was written by Jill Short, and some of you here will know Jill Short. She was a librarian in the old library of Queen Elizabeth House. And she still works in the Bodleian, even though she's retired. Now she volunteers. And Jill said, I was naive. I hadn't a clue when I started work at QEH in the library of the then Oxford University Institute of Commonwealth Studies. I didn't even know the names of many African countries. I gradually learned, got excited by African literature, Ngugi, Achebe, and then I felt horribly guilty. It was only when young Tajudeen arrived in Oxford and inspired us all with his energy and passion that I began to gain a clearer knowledge and insight, mainly through the night tutorials in my car, the African taxi, after an African Society meeting or disco, or a get-together in someone's house. I was no academic, but he helped me better understand African history, politics, and leaders. And before political correctness became so ridiculed, together we tried to think of alternatives for negative racist expressions in the English language, blackmail, blacklist, etc. And he gave me the confidence successfully to challenge a chain of local newsagents to remove an offensive greeting card from their shelves. I know he will still inspire through memories and his writing, but it's so sad that Taju himself is not out there making a difference in people's lives. Now, Taju touched on many lives when he was here as a student, and he was an intellectual, and I'm not going to read out all these. I have a lot of quotes which I'm not going to read out, but I will. You can, those of you who would like the slides, can get access to it. He was an intellectual, and again, Nana Busia wrote, Taju was a towering and organic scholar in the sense that he pursued scholarship not for his own sake. That is a kind of scholarship qua scholarship. Nor did he brandish academic qualifications as a status symbol or use it to lord over people. On the contrary, he placed the knowledge of the service of the African people's progressive movements and governments, thereby using his intellectual skills as a vital tool in the quest for social justice and advancement of the continent. And Salim, who was a former Secretary General of the African Union, said, a brilliant young scholar Taju could have gone straight to a top post in a development agency or in a Western university, but he sought to be in Africa, living in Uganda and then Kenya, from where he crisscrossed the continent. When I met with him before his death, he vowed that he would never live in Europe or North America again. He says, "Africa is my home." He was a Pan-Africanist, and he was described as a true Pan-Africanist. That should be in quotation marks. He refused to be confined by the petty regional nationalism of Nigerian politics, and instead he looked to the African continent as the arena in which to champion social justice and human freedom. Taju always talked of the need of a second liberation of Africa. Our previous speaker also recognized that. For Taju, the goals of unity and freedom were essential elements in the full emancipation of African people. And he started he used to publish these postcards regularly, what we call his Pan-African postcards. And they were published in Pambazuka News, in several newspapers, including the Ugandan Monitor and the Weekly Trust in Nigeria. And in Zimbabwe as well. I think one of the Zimbabwean newspapers carried his postcards. They were brief commentaries on life in Africa, often incorporating a searing critique of African regimes. And in his last postcard, he writes, "The irony of Africa being a very rich continent, but Africans being some of the poorest people in the world is no longer lost on anyone. While we can argue about the historical, structural, attitudinal, personal, and institutional causes of this state of affairs, the fact remains that the majority of our people remain in need amidst plenty." This particular postcard was railing against what he calls city beautification, whereby the government, the mayor, would send people in to clear off all the street traders. And in fact, I was reading yesterday that that's going to happen in Accra. They've just decided that they're going to clear Accra of street children. And I was disappointed to see people say this is a great idea. They should go back to the countries they came from. Blaming the free movement within ECOWAS. Taju obviously championed free movement and was against the use of borders within Africa to stop the free movement of people. And again, I'll just read the start of this. Whenever Pan-Africanists talk about colonialism, critics always say we're too focused on the past, escapist and blaming colonialism, when in their view, colonialism finished long time ago. My retort has always been, how I wish. The impact of colonialism is so pronounced in our lives that even our physical geography is determined by this shameful past. For instance, go to any of the fancy hotels on the continent and ask for the breakfast menu. The option you'll be given in many places is continental breakfast, but the continent will not be referring to the African continent. And if you ask for African meals, Nigerian hotels being exceptions in terms of always having African food, many of them will tell you that they needed 24 or 48 hours notice, yet they can offer you all kinds of so-called international cuisines. In Francophone countries, choices of cheeses and wines from particular regions of France are available on demand. So Taju, as I said, was the Secretary General of the 7th Pan-African Congress. And that was held between the 3rd and the 8th of April 1994. 5,000 delegates convened in Kampala, and I was one of the delegates from the UK. And there they called for the second liberation. And Taju notes in the conference program, the struggle calls for a strong and solid African unity of all progressive anti-imperialist forces that can be united against the colonially imposed borders. It has to be based on the unity of the grassroots popular masses across the artificial borders. And the slogan of the conference was "Don't agonize, organize." And I think what struck us at the time was the urgency of these principles as they were brought to the fore with the Rwandan genocide starting on the last day of the conference. Tajudeen supported initially the RPF in their struggle to end the genocide, but quickly became critical of the leaders who, he said, rode on the bandwagon of liberation, only to abandon their people once power is captured. It was highly, I'll pass on, these were some of the delegates. This was a book which was published out of, with some of the papers from the Congress. Move on. Taji was highly critical of African leaders, and he was not afraid of challenging them. And he argued in many of the postcards that they should respect term limits. And he said, in one, he said, the world has changed, and so much must revolutionaries. And he, move on. He was also critical of the African Union and the fact that it, the leaders promoted a narrow national identity. And he was anxious about the return of xenophobia on the continent, exemplified by attacks in South Africa and elsewhere. And at a meeting, I'm moving on, but I can send you these at some point. At a meeting, he was, Gaddafi was one also. At a meeting in Addis Ababa, he criticized Ethiopia, at OAU meeting, he openly criticized Ethiopia for having entry visa requirements that make it difficult for ordinary Africans to visit Ethiopia or even to get near the meetings of the African Union. And I think it was after that criticism that the Ethiopian government actually relaxed their rules relating to Africans being able to travel, being able to get visas to Ethiopia. So for him, there was a great need for regional citizenship and for African and for people to be able to move, as he said. They should have the right to move, settle and live, work and live without visas or passports from Cape Town to Cairo. But I think more, for me, what was important is Tajuddin's championing of the Pan-Africanism of the people. And it says it's now widely recognized that he said it is now widely recognized that Pan-Africanism needs to leave the confines of conferences and executive mansions of our leaders and become part and parcel of all our lives, building from the down up. He promoted gender equality, as I said, and a number of his postcards. He was particularly upset about maternal deaths in Africa, and through his role with the MDGs, he was pushing for programs that would tackle issues around maternal death. He lost both his mother and sister, through childbirth. They said it's not morally or politically right, and it cannot be acceptable that mothers die giving life. Mothers should not die giving life. He set up a school in Funtua, as I said, in memory of his mother. And he traveled widely promoting Pan-Africanism here in Ghana. But he was also a diplomat. He was not afraid of speaking truth to power, but he would do so in a way that was highly amusing. And therefore, people were much more willing to listen to him, apart from Bob Geldof, who said he would never go on TV with Tajuddin after one incident. As I said, he was an MG. He was a good friend. These are some of the photos of our time here. Some of you might recognize some of the people here in the 80s in Oxford. And we used to have a lot of parties, as was mentioned. But he was also a family man. His wife Munira and two daughters who are now grown up, and his sister and sister-in-law there. But finally, in relation to Taju, one of the things we did after he passed away was to publish a number of the postcards, and those that I've quoted are in this book called Speaking Truth to Power. And so for me, Tajuddin was a source of inspiration, and his determination, his Pan-Africanism, helped me through, helped me to develop a sort of relationship with Africa, which I probably wouldn't have had if I had not come to Oxford and met him and the fellow African students who were here at the time. And I want to finish now by just saying a few words about nurturing a Pan-Africanism of the people and how this might, what this might involve. And as I think the previous speaker said, and I've said earlier in relation to Taju's views, critics tend to point out, when we talk about Pan-Africanism, critics tend to point out divisions and xenophobia on the continent and say, well, you're not unified anyway. But they also look at divisions between continent, African people from the continent and between those in the diaspora, particularly those in what we call the old diaspora. And one question that has concerned me is how should African students and professionals relate to people who are of African descent in the diaspora? And what should be our role in Western institutions and in societies like the Africa Society? And how do we continue to promote this concept of Ubuntu that was mentioned earlier? In 2015, I noted at the time some Nigerian students could not see the importance of being involved in the Rhodes Must Fall movement, nor did many see the issue of racism as it affects people in the diaspora as a matter of concern. And it's worth debating their perspectives. Are they the consequence of historical amnesia, or a lack of empathy or solidarity with black people, or the failure of Pan-Africanism to transcend generations? More recently, I've asked myself, how do Africans relate to Wakanda, to the fuss in the press over Obama as the first black president, and Meghan Markle as the first black princess, where many have only known black presidents and princesses? Surely we need to factor in time and space or context more when we articulate a Pan-African outlook. And I turned, when I was thinking about this, to Walter Rodney, the Pan-Africanist Guyanese scholar. I'm going to move on a bit, sorry. And Rodney was observing, he was given a lecture in the 1960s to, I think in the late 1960s, to African Americans. And he was observing the differences between African students in the US and African and Caribbean students in the US and African Americans. And he argued, he said, I mean, I think his observations to me were quite instructive and important in terms of appreciating the difference as a basis for thinking about how we might go about change and emancipatory change and building Ubuntu between students. And he mentioned two axes of difference. And the first being African students. He said, the reason why Africans are top of the poll in that they do well in Africa, these are people coming straight from the continent, and Caribbean people as well, going straight to the US. They did well both in the United States and in the UK to some extent. And he said the reason why Africans are top of the poll, even though there's a lot more appearance than reality, there's still the definite appearance that the opportunity to recreate their society, there's the opportunity to recreate their society after their own image. After all, you can teach an African student, and next year he's in the Ministry of Finance as a permanent secretary, making policy, trying to construct in his own way the lives of his people, and intervening in history in a manner the black student in the US, or I would say UK, no, he will never in this system be able to do so. I think the immediacy of the possibility of participating in change is a critical variable for how African students do well, how they do in the Western context. And for me, this is borne out by my small sample. Many of my fellow students at the time have returned home to positions of influence in their countries. Rodney noted that the African American students, nevertheless, had a more advanced level of perception of the system, seeing it as essentially fraudulent, whilst Africans took the system at its own evaluation, and they say, we can get there, we just have to work hard, we can get there. Rodney, however, was critical of the African American students, because he felt that they needed to build and develop a work ethic, but nevertheless, one that does not take the system too seriously. And he argued they should work seriously. The key issue was that they should work seriously to establish an alternative, as distinct from working seriously to participate in the system. Rodney argued that we should not just enter institutions such as Oxford University to gain legitimacy, but we should become guerrilla intellectuals, to operate in the ages of the institution, to take from it and transform it over time. And I can contend that Africa Society, under the leadership of Tajuddin Abdul Rahim, provided a space for this struggle and for transformation. And the second axis that I picked up in axis of difference that Rodney mentioned was is an appreciation of the specificity of the different situations that African people have lived in and struggled, right? And I think, yeah, he then talked about the role of the African intellectual, and he argued our first responsibility is to define our own situation so that we can say to people, to our people, this is where we're at and where we're going. Secondly, he said, we need to present that responsibility to the world, to the rest of the world. So once we've defined where we are and where we're going, then we broadcast it. And the third is to help others in other sections of Black world to reflect on their own situation. And in doing so, we learn to appreciate difference. We learn to appreciate those situations, work with people to try to change them. Rodney, though a Marxist, was against generalizations and pushed in the discussion of the 6th Pan-African Congress in which he was involved for delegates to tackle racialized experiences of North Americans into their analysis of revolutionary change. For Rodney, Pan-Africanists had to appreciate the particular context in which Black people live across the globe and work with them through that context. Such a perspective requires a greater and more nuanced appreciation of difference, of national histories and cultures amongst African peoples, that Black people in Africa and across the diaspora have different historical experiences of race. So, those who promote Pan-Africanism, Rodney said, would need to recognize that to be effective, one must know the society. You must have a series of, and in fact, he was in Tanzania, but he left Tanzania because he wanted to go back to his own country, because he said, you need to appreciate that people have a series of responses and reflexes that come from having lived in a given experience, and that a revolution has to be made by people who are going to be grounded in that situation and who are going to stay there, who are going to make it part of their lives. So I think what I'm arguing, and this is concluding now, is that I suppose I am a bit disappointed with the divisions between the African students. The African Caribbean students and the African students are in separate societies, because, as I said when I was here, that was home for everyone. And perhaps it's to do with a lack of appreciation. I don't know. The committee members, the society members can tell me. Whether it's to do with a lack of appreciation of those national histories and those experiences that shape how we engage with institutions. And what we can do about that within the academy. And I was looking, not for this talk, but I was doing another talk somewhere. I was looking for literature, and I found quite an interesting one by two African academics working in the US, Josephine Beku-Betts and Warimo Njambi, and it was published in 2005 in a feminist journal. And they argue that Africans in the US experience a certain degree of dislocation, but nevertheless they had to come to learn that the presence of Africans in such institutions often operates as a mask to disguise the exclusion of African Americans. They say faculty members, students, administrators, alumni, and legislatures are informed that an institution is making progress in diversity, while little or no progress is made to include both African American faculty and students. And I'm a bit concerned that a similar thing might happen here with regards in institutions in Britain as they push for diversity. I would argue then that that as Black people struggle for the opening of space within the academy, the issue is how Pan-Africanists coming from the continent situate themselves within the UK context. How do they appreciate the specificities of our histories as Black British people, And will they continue to support our struggle? And I hope they will. And I hope the members of the Africa Society will take these comments into consideration. Thank you.
We need an unbroken thread of solidarity now more than ever in Oxford and in Britain, in Africa and in the diaspora. Taju taught us to look to the future. Too many of great talent have been and still are in the wrong place at the wrong time. Too many were sacrificed, nameless, and even named in the past. We mourn and honor and remember them. We must do that in our daily lives. Others were in the right place at the wrong time, or in the wrong place at the right time. I hope you will see the posters upstairs. More of them are coming. It has been a very long process to print them. So before we leave the building at 6 o'clock, I hope all of them will be up. So see the posters in the gallery upstairs. Oxford had icons like Malcolm X, like Martin Luther King, like Nelson Mandela, and like Tajuddin, and Oxonians like Kofi Busia and his daughter, who is with us today. They also had people like Gambutsu Marachera and Emeka Ojukwu. These were all African students in the University of Oxford. May we, the living, aspire now and in the future to make Oxford the right place at the right time. For the collectivity, the aggregate members of Oxford universities and Oxford cities, African and diasporic communities. We need to reach out more to Oxford Brooks, as the Society has already begun to do. Through that, we will come to see that that is the Taju that we knew. He lives on through the unbroken thread, if we keep it. He would exhort us, as has been said before, as he did to the Africa Society when he was president in 1989, time to stop complaining. Most of all, his memorable, don't agonize, organize. Practice self-reliance and foster solidarity. If you do not see somebody for a week, find them and offer support. Stress from fees, a death in the family, no money, no food, and loneliness take a toll. We all know that. Undo it with friendship. As the strong man with a brave heart said, always, as you draw breath, speak truth to power. Keep saying, I will speak truth to power. We can do this together.
Good afternoon, everyone. Professor Motosho, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, good. Professor Motosho is one of the most important scholars and public intellectuals of late 20th century, early 21st century Nigeria. Educated at King's College, Lagos, and the University of Ibadan, where he studied for a degree in Arabic and Islamic Studies and French. Professor Motosho went to Edinburgh University in 1969 on a Commonwealth Scholarship for a doctorate on contemporary Arabic theatre and drama, looking into ritual and performance in cultures. During his studies, he had a second supervisor at the Center for Middle East Studies in Oxford, so he had the benefit of this university too as part of his education. And he taught in the American University in Cairo.
He finished in 1972 and took up a lectureship at his former department at the University of Ibadan. In 1976, he moved to the then University of Ife, now Obafemi University, Ile-Ife. Here, working with Wole Soyinka, the first African Nobel laureate in literature, and others, he expanded his work of the university theatre into video recording for television stations. The publication of his first political biography of Nigeria just before dawn, in July 1988, created trouble for him. He felt stranded in Nigeria and so got out of the country. By the way, Professor Motosho, you promised me as a journalist when I interviewed you around 1991 that you were going to write a sequel to that book called Daybreak. I'm still waiting.
I wrote that.
He taught for a year at the University of Stirling, English Studies Department. Then he worked with Talawa Theatre in London before going to teach at the English Department of the National University of Lesotho in Southern Africa. In 1992, he moved to South Africa with his family. He taught at the University of the Western Cape and later at the University of Stellenbosch. After the death of his first wife, he left Cape Town for Johannesburg, where he worked in advertising and films. Professor Motosho says that when South Africa started looking like Nigeria, he decided to go back to Nigeria. He's at present a professor in the Performing and Film Arts Department of Elizabeth University, Ilara Mokin, in Ondo State, Nigeria. He has 3 children who decided that South Africa is still good enough to live in. They are still living there. The filmmaker Aki Omotosho and the IT engineer Dr. Elayo Omotosho and architect turned novelist Yewande Omotosho. So Professor Omotosho today will be speaking to the topic, Decline and Rise of Pan-Africanism in the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming this amazing scholar.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by congratulating the African Society on its 60th birthday. Now, you are old enough to begin to make comments on everybody and every society you wish to make comments on. At 60, I'm out of that. Second, I want to say that because of the difficulties that have accompanied and been with you, I promise to come my own steam to your next meeting, and I will make sure my visa is registered a year before that.
Professor, can you turn off your video? Just audio, because we can't hear you well.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Better.
Yes.
Better, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. MK Wakola, who won the state election in 2012, was one of the few Nigerian politicians who had come to support and be sympathetic to the issue of the Reformation. My secondary group area of study, Arab. Why that the captain of Islamic studies at Paris, I got involved with my former therapist, John Baldwin, with the African Arab United Arab Emirates. This involvement worked with the Academy on his program of Arabship, his Arabization Center in Southern Sudan. This was a program for making Africans Arabs. Of course, this involvement created an endless argument between the Arab and the organization of the The Arab countries back and apartheid, while African countries fight apartheid because of Palestine. The question then is that what happens to Arab countries when apartheid is defeated and Pakistan has been recognized as a country? There was silence. Where was the asked is the Arab today? Where Where is Afro-Arab relations? Where does Pan-Africanism meet up Arab consciousness? When every North country calls itself the Arab home place of God. In 1975, Morocco occupies Sahrawi, the former Spanish colony abundant fossil, fish, and offshore oil reserves. The Organization of African Unity rejected Morocco's occupation and recognized the policying of the people of Sahrawi. Morocco walked out of the African Organization of African Unity. Last year, during the African Month on, by the President Sarah Jacob Zuma, as happened representative of Sahrawi and the Sahrawi Arab Republic Sarah, I had traveled to Nigeria actively campaigning here. How come, I asked, Morocco has seen rehabilitated African against just himself. What is left to me now and my Afghan region? What is left for the Afghan South and the non-solution of the Palestinian state? In order to properly interpret countries of Pan-Africanism past and future, there is need to look at other and pan policy and pan ideas, and have listed this in my presentation, which the members of the committee can look at. What is interesting is that both and anything survive is the Pan-American Pan-Americanism which has survived in this. That survival has been brought to America, took over the Pan-African in 1890 and made its headquarters in Washington. The governing body is made up of US Secretary of State and represents all references. So, 5 come to Pan-Africanism. The circumstances of coming in of the movement is too well there to. So, whilst still African alive with both political and cultural response, the political actors on political of the continent, the complete creation of every country on the continent, the affirmation of cultural points, as well as continental and the continental army. Political agenda used to fight nationalists to achieve the simplification states, inspired all. After the achievement of
Professor, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
yes,
the audio is too bad, so I think I will read the rest of your presentation.
pardon me?
Unfortunately, we can't hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we've been trying to follow with the text, but it's not working. So I think I will need to read the rest of it.
When he says, "Can you hear me?" It's not perfect.
Okay. Can I just then conclude? My contribution is basically that it is only through.
Are you reading from the page?
No, I'm not reading.
Okay.
Can I go on?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
I'm saying that because of the nature of Caribbean, African American consciousnesses, Pan-Africanism has not worked. Because of the duplication of African state and Arab state in Africa, Pan-Africanism is not working there either. So the only thing that is going to work Pan-Africa, or at least Africa start of Sahara, is what I call actionable ideas, which Africans, Black Africans, can begin to work upon to create their own relationships. That is the only insight. Thank you very much.
So the text will be this. So can you wait 5 minutes on the, so we can show you. Can you turn on your video feed again?
Your own audio is off.
Okay. Can you turn on your video feed again?
It's we who need to turn it on because it's off.
Yeah, so that's ours. Professor Omotosho?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So, yeah, just to, so you can.
Please.
So
Thank you very much.
So I'm sorry for the quality that we couldn't make it work, but we will distribute your paper to everyone present, and they will be receiving their inboxes, and we are looking forward for your visits.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So I will now introduce our next speaker, Ambassador Busia, coming from Brazil. So she has lived and studied in Oxford for over a decade. First acquiring a BA from St. Anne's, and then a doctorate from St. Antony's in race relations. She's also written a lot, also starting from when she was a student and a president of the society. So we have a copy of the magazine that was edited in 1980, and which we can distribute. Part of it you can see on the posters.
And passes the word from her prison cell, whispering like a widow is coming. Rainbow serpent, who must not go unspoken, I have offered up the safety of separations, sung the spirals of power and what fills the spaces before power unfolds or flounders in desirable non-essentials. I am a black woman stripped down and praying. My whole life has been an altar worth its ending, and I say Aiguedu is coming. I may be a weed in a garden of women I have loved who are still trapped in their season, but even they shriek as they rip burning gold from their skins. Aiguedu is coming. We are learning by heart what has never been taught. You are my even fire-tongued Oya, Sebulisa, Mau, Afrikiti, and now we are mourning our sisters lost to the false hush of sorrow, to hardness and hatchets and childbirth, and we are shouting Rosa Parks and Fanny Luhema, Asata Shakur and Yara Asantewa, my mother and Winnie Mandela are singing in my throat. The Holy Ghost linguist, one iron silence broken. Aiguedu is calling, calling. Your daughters are named and conceiving. Mother loosen my tongue or adorn me with a lighter burden. Aduhwelu is coming. Aduhwelu is coming. Aduhwelu is coming. That was a poem called Call from the 1986 collection Our Dead Behind Us by the late, great Audre Lorde. Black, Grenadian, African-American, cosmopolitan, cultural worker, woman warrior. One of the most extraordinary women fighters of the 20th century. I first heard that poem read by Audre Lorde at a conference on black women back in about 1984. And she read it as a chant, like I just did. And it is a poem which changed my life, changed me as a poet. Because when I heard Audre Lorde, I recognized the courage and I recognized, in a sense, the familiarity of the form. I am a Ghanaian. I was born in Ghana. I grew up in Holland, Mexico, and England. And in my, what would have been my third year of doctoral studies here at St. Antony's, I went to the United States for 15 months to do research. And that 15 months turned into 35 years. I came back, I had the privilege of being one of the last students of Professor Kenneth Kirkwood. A man who, thank you. A man who taught us much about what it means to mentor scholars. Because he started first. He used to ask us questions that our erudite peers thought were ridiculous, like, did you travel with your wife? Do your children have a good nursery school? Do you have a bank account? Do you know your bank manager? Lessons, questions which, down the years we realized he made sure we answered those questions well before we picked up a pen to think we were going to be able to write. Because, you know, a lot of us were international students. If you didn't know your bank manager and your wife wasn't happy and your children didn't went to a good school, you had a problem. Anyway, I digress. Audre Lorde's poem, Call, gave me permission. Because I realized in the poem and in its form that there were radically different possibilities that were both new and ancient. One of the first things that I did when I heard that poem was to find the courage to write the first and still remains the only poem I've ever written in Twi, my father's language. Because, like so many of us at home, we're all educated in English, in addition to which I grew up in exile without a Ghanaian community. There were not too many Ghanaians in Holland in the 1960s. And when we came to England, the Ghanaians were afraid because we were in exile from Nkrumah's Ghana at a time when Nkrumah's Ghana was changing. And it was not good for your health to be associated with the leader of the opposition. Until I heard Audre Lorde. And then I wrote one poem, which I'll just give you a taste of it. I won't do the whole thing because I want to perform a different poem of mine. But it's a poem called Mao. And it's a poem that, for me, is an incantation. but it was also a play on words. I've written about it because, you see, it's a play that, first of all, brings about issues of gender and birthing and the magnificence of the creator. But it's also a poem that wrestles with language and the standardization of orthography. Because Mau, like Aduhwedu, for those of you who don't know it, Aduhwedu is the rainbow serpent, representative of ancient divinities who must be worshipped, but whose names and faces have been lost in time. And Mau is the female aspect of Maulisa, the ancient god of the homies, another creativity, goddess of creation. And I wrote this poem, but you see, in English orthography, Mau is spelled M-A-W-U. But in Shui, the language in which the poem was conceived, you have to write it M-A-W-O, or at least that, that backwards O thing, I don't know what it's called in phonetic. Oh, you have to write O. Because M-A-W-U means not, and because Mau is either the name of the goddess, or Mau means I have given birth, but M-A-W-U is Meru, which means I have died. so I wrote this poem, which is a play on words on that, which I would otherwise read you, but I want to get on to the point, except to say that that experience made me think differently about the possibilities of what poetry is and does for people who are both Pan-Africanist and diasporic, and who take both of those issues as ethical stands. And just another brief digression to response to the two papers we heard this morning. We do need to think about what Pan-Africanism can materialize into, and how we can resist globalization and get it to mean what we need it to mean. But we can show those gestures, though. We can begin by looking at ourselves and trying to decide where do we stand and what are our own gestures of solidarity. You'll probably notice, because I'm sitting at the front, I stood up for Nkosi Sikeleli. I stand up for two anthems, other than national anthems, when the president is present. You sing Nkosi Sikeleli, I will stand. You sing Lift Every Heart and Sing, I will stand. Because those are two anthems which actually have been carved out of the blood in a search for liberation. We can show who we are by respecting the struggle of those people we care for and claim to stand with. And what I want to share with you this afternoon is 3 poems. The first one you've just heard, by Audre Lorde. The second one will be a poem called For the Poets by Jane Cortez, and the third one will be my own poem for Nelson Mandela. But to help you appreciate why I have chosen these poems, I want to give you the context in which I would like you to hear them. And hearing them, particularly in the case of Lorde and Cortez, is absolutely critical to what I'm trying to say. Because you see, what I'm trying to demonstrate is that Pan-Africanism is not simply theoretical. It's not just an ideological, political gesture. It is embodied and it is experiential. And we have people who can assemble the knowledge of that embodiment and make us experience it. And I'm trying to share with you poems that do that. But first, I want to share with you the classic definition. You see, these poems depend on what the great critic, I realized as I'm reading this that I'm talking about friends of mine, all of whom have passed away. Jane Cortez has passed away, Audrey Lorde has passed away, Leve Clark has passed away. I'm still here. The wonderful scholar Leve Clark gave a classic definition of diaspora literacy, which she says depends on the reader's ability to comprehend the literature of Africa, Afro-America, and the Caribbean from an informed indigenous perspective. The field is multicultural and multilingual, encompassing writing in European and ethnic languages. In the current textual environment, diaspora literacy would suggest that the names such as Popuvo, Legba, Mandes Nambuk, Nani, Jose Marti, Bigger Thomas, and Marie Chauvet represent mnemonic devices whose recall releases a learned tradition. Mnemonic devices whose recall releases a learned tradition. You were moved by hearing me read Audrey Lorde. What that poem means would get a different kind of richness if you know who Rosa Parks, Asatu Shakur, Ya Asatiwa, and Ailuedu are. This type of literacy is more than a purely intellectual exercise. It's a skill for both narrator and reader, which demands a knowledge of historical, social, cultural, and political development generated by lived and textual experience. Throughout the 20th century, diaspora literacy has implied an ease and intimacy with more than one language, with interdisciplinary relations among history, ethnology, and the folklore of regional expression. So that's the first thing I need you to bear in mind in terms of the context in which I want you to hear these poems. The second one is I want you to understand the concept of the poetry of witness in the realm of the social as expressed by the American poet Caroline Forshey. Caroline Forshey is a great poet herself, but she's also an Antony anthologist who has spent a lot of time anthologizing the poetry of imprisoned freedom fighters and so on, and has talked a lot about the poetry of witness. And the tradition of diaspora poetry is a commitment to social justice through an acceptance of diasporic vision and a worldview which takes as given a shared political sense of an ethical audience. So, Caroline Forshey's definition of the poetry of witness, she says, in the poetry of witness, the poem makes present to us the experience of the other. The poem is the experience rather than a symbolic representation. When we read the poem as witness, we are marked by it and become ourselves witnesses to what it has made present before us. Language incises the page, wounding it with testimonial presence, and the reader is marked by the encounter with that presence. Witness begets witness. The text we read becomes a living archive. The published writer is one who has been made public and so has entered the social realm where ideas are discussed and language attended. In urgent times, when much is at stake, what we do and say matters, as does our silence and failure to act. If we do not stand apart and stand against the wrongs committed in our name, we become one of those who went along quietly in the service of those who make history, rather than, as Camus famously wrote, in the service. Shared political history and the different strategies employed and demanded by an agency of reading that recognizes the need to transform the history being challenged. This is a political strategy in which writers with knowledge of what is happening around the Black world deliberately create work in which to fully understand what they're doing, you need to understand other aspects of the black world rather than simply the place you stand. You must begin with the place you stand. But the place you stand cannot be the only place you care about. Diaspora literacy is therefore in some way a sense in which we see ourselves and recognize our lost history, and therefore a strategy to help others do the same. As you heard, Call rests on knowledge of different kinds of histories, both in its creation and its performance. It's a poem which, for many reasons, as I said, changed me as a poet. It rests on an understanding of the myth of Ayuhwedu, the rainbow serpent, the female aspect of the divine creator, as well as an understanding of the power of juxtapositions on which the poem depends. We have to recognize the names that she calls out, and then we have to appreciate why we have Ayuhwedu, the rainbow serpent, spoken about in common with the woman cleaning the Capitol toilets. Why Rosa Parks and Winnie Mandela are together with Nahal Harriet's Anointed. Why Hanu Luhema and Assata Shakur are there. Because then we begin to appreciate the sense of that old creative power. And Broad's poem becomes the prophetic voice of a Creole who comes through these juxtapositions to make the ancient relevant to today.
I need kai kai, a glass of apatashi, from the torn arm of Bessie Smith. I need the smell of usuka, the body sweat of a Durbar. 5 tap dancers from those fleshy blue skins from the deep south to many roll forward praise for Christopher Okipo. I need a cane field of superstitious women, fumes and feathers from the port of Lobito, skull of a mercenary, ashes from a Texas lynching, the midnight snakes of Davala, liquid from the eyeballs of a leopard, sweet oil from the ears of an elder, to make a delta praise for the poets, On this day, approaching me like a mystic number, in this time slot on death row, in this flesh-picking Sahelian zone, in this dynamite dust and dragon blood and liver cut, I need cockroaches, Congo Square, a scan of Skokian, from flaming mouth of a howling wolf, I need the smell of Harlem, spirits from the birthplace of Basuto, mysteries from an Arkansas pyramid, shark teeth, buffalo, gorillas in the rainy season, to boogie forward juju praise for Henry Dumas. In this day of surging hundreds Zanzibars, in this day of bongo club moon cafes and paradise lounges, in this day's pounded torso of burgundy mush, in this steel cube, in this domino, in this dry period, I need tongues like coiling pythons, spearheads gushing from the Gulf of Guinea, the broken ankles of a B.J. Forster, to light up this red velvet jungle. I need pink spots from the lips of trumpet players, the abdominal scars of 7 headhunters, a gun slick for electric watermelon seeds to flush, a delta praise for the poets, because they'll try to shoot us like they shot Henry Dumas, because we massacre each other and Christopher Okipo is dead, because I can't make the best of it, because I'm bystander. Because mugging is not my profession. I need one more Pesos night to make a hurricane. I need one more hate mouth racist stuck in the other end of a gas pipe to make flames. I need one more good funky black path, to shake forward a dance of praise for the poets, On this day of living dead Dumas, on this day of living dead Okibo, I need kai, I need durbers, I need torn arms, I need cane fields, I need feathers, I need skulls, I need ashes, I need snakes, I need eyeballs, I need cockroaches, I need sharp teeth, I need buffalo, I need spirits, I need ankles, I need hurricanes, I need gas pipes, I need black pipes, I need to make a dance of praise for the poets. There are two poems in my life that I wish I had written. They're two completely contrasting poems. As a literary scholar, I wish I'd written Keats's Ode to Autumn. And as an activist, I wish I could pretend that poem was mine. But it ain't. Jane Cortez. I want to end with my poem for Nelson Mandela. A poem which is my tribute to diaspora literacy. I learned a lot from other poets. And I learned above all the value of our experiences. And I also want to end with this poem because many of the experiences that I recall in the poem, I learned here in Oxford. Not just at this university. I grew up, I'm a Windrush Valley girl at heart. I grew up in Stanlake, a little village on the River Windrush, just 12 miles away. And I came to Oxford, as you heard, I was president. There are a few of us dinosaurs still left around. The thing that I'm most proud of, December 1979, the Lancaster House Agreement. Those people were locked up in Lancaster House and they were fighting to craft finally agreement for the independence of Zimbabwe. And Robert Mugabe left Lancaster House only once to accept our invitation to come and address the Oxford University Advocacy Society. It was a moment of great pride. When I left here, I went to Rutgers University, where that university was starting its anti-apartheid campaign. It's not known about it because, as always, private institutions always get more accolades than the state universities. But actually, the activities of those of us at Rutgers, and I have to say hats off to our students, but Rutgers University became the first total divestment university in the first total divestment state in the Union. We did it, and we're a state university, so when this university said we're going to divest everything, the state followed. And it was student activism that led it. I was there. And then, so in 1990, I was on leave from Rutgers at UCLA. Those of us who are old enough to remember will remember that we have been having this, talk. Is Mandela going to be released? Is he going to be released? And it was going to be tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And he'd been in jail for 27 years. Free Nelson Mandela was a slogan, but it had long ceased to become. You didn't believe it was going to happen. Not after, we were going to keep on saying it, but, was it going to happen? Except for the fact that somewhere we had a sneaking feeling that the worst thing for the apartheid regime would be for Mandela to actually die in jail. They probably had enough way to figure out that that would not be a good idea. But then suddenly, it like everybody's going around saying it's going to happen, you know, people. I remember getting a phone call from a friend and saying, you know, Mandela's going to be released tomorrow. And I said, ho hum. She said, no. There are cameras on the streets, news cameras on the streets, doing on-the-spot interviews of people, asking them how they feel about this. I turned on the television and Nelson Mandela was going to be released. And I remember sitting up that night, from 10 o'clock at night to 2 o'clock in the morning. This is the longest poem I've ever written in the shortest amount of time. Because by that time I was irritated by the way people were saying 27 years like it was 27 seconds. And I thought, does anybody remember what 27 years actually meant? I remember the arrest of Mandela. I was 10 years old. Because, see, my family had moved from Holland to England in the December of 1962. It was the coldest winter on record since until the December of something like 1999 or something like that. And again, what happened in January of 63 was the Profumo affair and the fall of the Macmillan government, which brought in the first Labour government since the war, headed by Harold Macmillan, who was my father's economics tutor when they were both at Oxford. And 1963 effectively ended with the assassination of John Kennedy in the streets of Dallas, Texas in November. And that was the year that Mandela, that the Rivoni trials began. So, I sat down that night and thought, does anybody remember? The poem is called Testament for the First Accused, Nelson Mandela for the 27 years, because Mandela was actually in prison already when the trial started, and they took him out of prison to make him stand trial as the first accused. And his statement from the dock at the end of the trial begins with the words, I am the first accused. I know Patrice Lumumba had been some time dead, and Silvanus Olympio only just, but not sure why. As I try to reconnect myself with my child's mind and the memories of events that jumble there, a knowledge of our distant world pieced together through overheard conversations and voices on the radio. In 1962, the world was a very different place. I didn't know where Montgomery was, but I'd learned the meaning of boycott. Didn't understand Mau Mau, except it taught the impact of lies and what all freedoms cost. I remember your name and vague talk of a trial and treason being a serious thing. Sisulu and Mbeki, Goldberg and Baklava, Kathrada, Moswaledi and Blangeni at Rivonia. These names I've learned through the years, but at the time, what I recall for sure is a baby Bikila's second Olympic gold. And Cassius Clay proving he was the greatest by the time you made your statement and disappeared. We have not seen you since. I didn't mark your 50th birthday, but in Ghana, J.B. Dankwa was already dead. And we had lived through coups and counter-coups already at the start of a second republic. While Baldwin warned of a fire next time, the white Rhodesians declared UDI and the Zimbabweans braced for war. But we were killing our brothers already in Biafra, while the whole world watched. And a young Christopher Keeper reminded us that even the poets were dying, and you were still alive, and you were still not free. Though James Brown danced us off the streets, and soul came to soul in Ghana, no one remembered Paul Robeson, and Mahalia Jackson sang her last, singing, "We shall overcome." Through frustrated freedom summers, we left Mississippi, Watts, and Newark burning, and Medgar, Malcolm, and Martin dead, all dead, and you were still alive, and you were still not free. In an angry and lonely world, we mark the passage of your 10th year, reading letters to Martha and Soledad, brother. All souls were on ice, as Arthur Nortshire killed himself in an Oxford room, and exiled Kabaka died. We freed Angela Davis, but on your desolate island, you were still alive, and you were still not free. Your 60th birthday reminded us this struggle was your life. But by then, your life had become our struggle. As we buried Hector Peterson and 100 slaughtered children on the scorched streets of Soweto. With the jailed Kandi Motisi, we cried freedom for a murdered Stephen Biko. People young enough to be your children, and children younger than your children dead. So many of them dead, yet you at least were still alive, but you were still not free. We shouted Frelimo when another empire fell. Antonio Jacinto survived Tarrafal, but Augustino Neto was dead. Eduardo Mondlane had been many years murdered, and we have since mourned the wreckage of Samora Machel on the South African side of Mozambique's mountains. But you were still alive, and you were still not free. By your 20th year, Anwar Sadat had sued for peace in the Knesset and had been later killed for his pains. And Haile Selassie, the Lion of Judah, had disappeared, leaving no memorial except a 3,000-year imperial kingdom now decades at war. And in Eritrea, Tigray, the Sudan, the Spanish Sahara, the harvest of our dreams brittle wind of nightmares. And we searched for Janani Luwum among Kampala's martyred. Mali, who sang for Manley and Mugabe, was so young dead, but you were still alive, and you were still not free. The decades bring the deaths of leaders. The power and the myth that was Nkrumah lie broken, like his shattered statue on the Accra streets. And in the same week that Jomo Kenyatta faced his sacred Mount Kenya for the final time, Kofi Busia's challenge to an Africa in search of democracy ended. All your peers were dead, but you were still alive, and you were still not free. Yet, on a continent being liberated, redeemed, revolutionized, proclaiming Uhuru, the people were marching. 25 years after Sharpeville, we march. 10 years after Soweto, we march. And when they killed mothers and babies on their march through Mamelodi, still with them we march, for you were still alive and you were still not free. By the time we reached your 70th birthday, another generation of children had learned to call your name. We carry old images of your face in our hearts and on the t-shirts on our backs as an icon of a new morning. The temple warrior prince, the lawyer activist, the prisoner. Around the world, we march in our aliens, demanding your return into a troubled world, so sadly bereft of heroes. For you were still alive, and you were still not free. You disappeared from our view, from a world which had taken no small steps on the moon for man, no Apollos, no Challengers, no Saiyuts, no photographs of the furthest planets, no walks in space. The small steps taken on Earth for mankind had included no Flower Power Love concerts at Woodstock, no One Love Peace concerts in Kingston, Jamaica, no Art Against Apartheid Freedom concerts in Sun City, no bands in Aid proclaiming we are the world. That world had known no cultural revolution in China, no drafted US troops in Vietnam, no killing fields in Cambodia, no vanished prisoner without a name in a cell without a number, mourned by the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and through this all, you were still alive, and you were still not free. And now, it is the Lord's Day, the 11th of February 1990, and it is 5 a.m. in Los Angeles, California. It is 8 a.m. in New York and Kingston, Jamaica. It is 1 p.m. in Stockholm, London, and Accra, Ghana, and half the marching world has paused to keep vigil, for it is 3 p.m. in Cape Town, South Africa, and we wait to see your face. After 27 years of fighting, marching, and singing, we keep a 90-minute watch to see you take these next few steps on this, your no easy walk to our uncertain freedom. To witness your release into this changing world, unceasingly the same. For you are still alive, but we are still not free. Amandla Mandela, la lucha continua.
Thank you, Ambassador Busia, for your talk and performance. Also, that and external chaos, and through them being experienced by everyone else. So I think I can say and believe everyone here can say that you embodied Pan-Africanism, and we thank you for the opportunity to experience it to you. Some of the authors, I will use this opportunity to remind you that there is a book exhibition upstairs by Nana Yebia Clark, so from the Clark Publishing. So that's one of the books you can find, and please go. So please go and continue to. Yeah, so it's just here upstairs. You won't miss it. So our next and last speaker is Simukai Chigudu, an associate professor in the Department of Development Studies of International Development in Oxford. Simukai was first a medical doctor before deciding and being having kind of like an illumination and starting to study in the MSc for African Studies and then doing his PhD in Development Studies. So he was also a long-term member of the Oxford University Society, of which he was a committee member just 4 or 5 years ago. So please welcome Simukai, who will be.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And of course, for this invitation to speak on the 60th anniversary of the Africa Society. It's an extraordinary honor for me to speak on this particular occasion and on this platform. Although I must admit to a certain degree of disgruntlement with the organizers for placing me after the ambassador. I feel like not only is that an incredibly tough act to follow, it's sort of a mic drop moment, but I'll do the best that I can. So my talk today is entitled Being and Becoming African in Oxford, Reflections. And I don't really have a paper or an argument. I have a series of reflections and thoughts on my own personal journey through Oxford and how I've had to contend with and think about what it means for me to be African. And this kind of ongoing and evolving relationship with this massive continent that means so many different things to so many of us. And I want to start with a quote from the diary of Chigudu Cole after a trip he took to London. And too soon, Cole writes, London ends. The taxi ride from the South Bank to Paddington Station is a march past of empire. The Houses of Parliament, Westminster Abbey, Buckingham Palace, and its enormous grounds. There are many statues of great men, including Abraham Lincoln. I noticed for the first time the memorial gates of Hyde Park Corner. The gates carry the names of Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Africa. You experience yourself in the particular, and everywhere you are received as a broad generality. Now, Jordi spoke this afternoon that the relationship between Oxford and Africa, to put it euphemistically, is ambivalent. And it's this ambivalence I want to dwell on throughout my reflections. Unquestionably, a sense of history prevails throughout this university. Its finely manicured gardens, its beautiful cloisters, its stunning towers, dubbed by the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold, the city of dreaming spires, is a tribute to any number of histories, but a particular notion, a British self-conception of pride, of intellectual refinement, and of enlightenment. At the same time, of course, hidden within these histories are many other bodies, many other stories that are often untold and often quiescent. As an African, being here is at once thrilling, but also intimidating. The university has a tremendously rich intellectual landscape for the study of African history, politics, culture, society, literature, and philosophy. And at the same time, one can't help but feel often ghettoized and marginal, as many of the university's older, more prestigious colleges don't admit hardly if any African students, as the representation of issues related to Africa are treated as option courses, if at all, on many undergraduate curricula, as your receipt within Oxford is often treated as one of, you should be grateful to be here. As opposed to rightfully deserving a space within what is ostensibly a cosmopolitan and progressive institution of learning. And not to put too fine a point on it, but it is worth dwelling on Hugh Trevor Roper, the former Regis Professor of History, who was here for some 40 years or something, widely held within the history department and within this country as one of Britain's greatest historians, died in 2002. And said, there is no history in Africa. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest are the unedifying gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but otherwise irrelevant parts of the globe. And so, of course, what then does it mean to come and study Africa in a place like Oxford? How does one contend with these very contradictions present and reproduced in its architecture, in its history, in whom it glorifies and memorializes, and whom it marginalizes, who gets access in terms of money, who goes to which dinners, and who is treated as a mere guest, a foreigner, an interloper. And I think in this sense, for me, being part of the Africa Society became so important. It It was a forum in which we could think about Africa, form networks with other Africans and those concerned about and committed to the continent and its myriad issues. As well as a chance, of course, very practically for career building and thinking about what a life in the academy might entail. But I also think that the Africa Society, and in my tenure as Vice President from 2014 to 2015, served another function. Whether we liked it or not, being in the Africa Society foisted upon us an ambassadorial role. One of constantly trying to assert our presence and identity in Oxford, to negotiate a sense of belonging, and to rehabilitate an image of the continent. At times this was expressed in the kinds of events that we held in things like the Oxford Africa Conference. It is of course not enough to do a conference that discusses key political issues on the continent. It has to be a spectacle. We have to show the folks at Blavatnik or at the Oxford Union or in this college or any other college that Africans are as good as any other group of people at putting together and bringing forth corporations and presidents and celebrities to come and speak at our events. That we are turned up in our fine aesthetics, that we can use a sophisticated vocabulary, and we can demand that Africa rightfully has its place in an institution like Oxford. In many ways, the experience of being in the Africa Society and simultaneously trying to meet these different ends made me think a lot about Haile Selassie's essay on Afropolitanism. Selassie writes that we Afropolitans are the newest generation of African immigrants, coming soon or collected already at a law firm, chemistry lab, or jazz lounge near you. You'll know us by our funny blend of London fashion, New York jargon, African ethics, and academic successes. We are Afropolitans, not citizens, but Africans of the world. Selassie continues, what distinguishes Afropolitans, both in the West and at home, is a willingness to complicate Africa. That is to say, to engage with, critique, celebrate the parts of Africa that means most to us, while at the same time refusing to oversimplify. The effort to understand what is ailing in Africa alongside the desire to honor what is wonderful, what is unique. Rather than essentializing the geographic entity, we seek to comprehend its cultural complexity, to honor the intellectual and spiritual legacy, and to sustain our parents' cultures. Ultimately, the Afropolitan must form an identity along at least three dimensions: national, racial, cultural, and all of the subtle tensions between these. Now, of course, Selassie's essay has come under intense critique for its self-conscious celebration of what it means to be Africa. And it performs another peculiar function, which is on one hand, I think, sort of beautifully illustrating the possibilities of being an African in the world, while at the same time creating a certain sense of duty and performativity, that one is constantly having to think about that identity and perform it in these spaces. It is not enough just to be you. If you're going to be in a place like Oxford, you have to be an Afropolitan. This is how we get past an impoverished image of Africa. We try to overlook or contend with the racism of the Hugh Trevor Ropers of this world. Not to mention, of course, the likes of Cecil John Rhodes, whom, unsurprisingly, I will be speaking about momentarily, as well as the unrelenting slights that we constantly face here. I mean, the number of times I've walked into Oxford colleges and have been carded ID, treated with suspicion, questioned about whether I belong here, having to burnish my academic credentials to vindicate my position as an academic, as a student, as an activist in this place. And I think it's really troubling because you're constantly sort of not only just treated with suspicion and as an interloper, infantilized when you assert your African identity too strongly, celebrated and then critiqued for being an elitist when you identify as Afropolitan, derided for not engaging sufficiently with home, but never quite belonging here either. And so I think these are the tensions that then play out, in something like Africa Society. We necessarily have to forge some kind of unity around the identity of being African, belying the host of differences that exist between us, culturally, politically, aesthetically, and so forth, and not really being able to engage with those differences in rich, deep, and nuanced ways, because part of leading the Africa Society means asserting Africa's presence in Oxford. So, for instance, when we ran the conference, there were quite intense and quite important discussions to be had about what is the purpose of the Oxford Africa Conference. Are we trying to perpetuate a kind of corporatist Afri-capitalism? Or are we trying to engage with a more serious discussion of a more politicized Pan-Africanism? And in a way, the experience as a collective of being marginal narrows the space for these kinds of discussions. It narrows the space for talking about the things that highlight our own differences in terms of race, sexuality, religion, all the things that are so integral to how we live in and experience the world, and yet are given little room to breathe when constantly trying to fight for your own space here. Another response that I became a part of in my journey here was to take part in Rhodes Must Fall, a much more direct confrontation with Oxford's deeply, deeply entrenched, and make no mistake about it, I mean, this place is so replete with racism, it's almost laughable. And to see buildings and statues and tributes to the great men of empire while silencing the famines and conquests that they've left in their wake. To be told constantly that we need to celebrate the munificence of the likes of Rhodes while not being adequately able to point out the rather banal fact that he was a co-architect of one of the most authoritarian and egregious systems of government the world has seen. And so, during my time at Rhodes Must Fall, I think one of the most consistent and striking things was the sheer hostility and defensiveness with which much of the university's leadership looked upon the Rhodes Must Fall movement. I'm not going to rehash the whole story here, but I just want to share a few choice quotes and experiences of what it was like to be an African and an activist and trying to challenge Oxford to take a slightly more critical look at its own history. I'll start with Daniel Hannon, a Conservative Party member of Parliament and an alumnus of Oriel College, who wrote an op-ed for the Daily Telegraph very shortly after Oriel College had released a statement saying that they were going to take the concerns of Rhodes Must Fall students seriously. Hannon wrote that the Rhodes Must Fall campaign was too silly for words. He derogated the movement as cretinous, dismissed its demands as facile, and deemed that the students in the movements were too dim to be at university. Now, I go a step further and say that Hannon was simply articulating what many people think. If you come here as a minority body and say that your history matters, a consistent kind of rhetorical strategy is to undermine and infantilize you, downright insult you. I found myself in this ridiculous situation of having to say, well, actually, I have a medical degree, a master's in medical and molecular research, a master's in public health, a master's in African studies, and a PhD. But then at the same time, constantly reflecting back on what that means for me, that for me to feel like I have a legitimate sense to be here and to assert my presence means that I not only have to do what my white British colleagues are doing, but I have to do it 10 times over, 10 times faster, and 10 times better. And what an extraordinary burden is then placed on what it means to be African in this university. For us, the requisite standard of excellence is so much higher than it would be when we treat it like anybody else. This continues. Hannon goes on to write that Cecil Rhodes is commemorated by Oriel because he left money to the college. Accepting that money in 1902 and honoring the benefactor doesn't mean endorsing his opinions, as if it were merely Rhodes's opinions that were contentious. Hannon then glibly asserted that almost any historical figure you can imagine did something that we now found unpleasant. How very British. Oxford and Rhodes Must Fall students must simply move on from such histories. I will gladly do so when the British move on from celebrating Churchill every goddamn year. In an opinion piece for The Times on the 22nd of December, the now somewhat notorious Regis Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology, Nigel Bigger, went further and submitted that Rhodes was a committed imperialist, yes, but that the charges of racism against him were unsupported. I'm not going to waste any more breath on Bigger. The celebrated classicist and Cambridge professor Mary Beard argued that Rhodes Must Fall is a dangerous attempt to erase the past. Let me correct that for you, Mary. Rhodes Must Fall is a subtle and intellectually sophisticated attempt to bring the past into a much fuller purview of critical discussion. Beard went on to suggest that minority students should simply be empowered to look at the statue of Rhodes with, and I quote, a cheery and self-confident sense of unmatchability. Meanwhile, Will Hutton, a noted political economist, Guardian columnist, and principal of Hartford College, went on to say that if it were not for the legacies of the British Empire, South Africa would descend into unaccountable despotism as embodied by then President Jacob Zuma. He put forward that for all its imperfections, the imperial project ultimately bequeathed South Africa with the courts, rule of law, free press, freedom of association and expression. Now, going back to what it means to study African politics, history, in a university where a principal of a college can equate apartheid with the freedom of association simply boggles the mind. At a dinner at my own college, St. Anne's, Baroness Ruth Deach, after whom a building is named, stood up and proudly declared that the likes of Rhodes Must Fall were simply snowflakes, indulging in a victimhood culture, unable to engage in any serious or robust debate. At the time, I was the only black person, the only African person sitting at high table, and had to engage in the genteel conversations with the white men around me about how do we respond to these student demands. I politely smiled, of course, and said, maybe we need to just think about this from a slightly more critical perspective. And I think, again, this is something that's kind of quintessential about negotiating spaces like this, having to defend one's identity and having to perform it within a language that is seen as acceptable to the kind of hegemonic norm. And I think for me, what troubles me about these kinds of assertions and about this sort of ambivalence between, on one hand, asserting African identity, being sort of Afropolitan and losing one's own sense of identity, is a belying of a tremendous complexity about what it means to be a human, what it means to be a young person, what it means to grow up, to study, to learn, to date, to form, to be friends with people, and to enjoy your university as an opportunity for growth and exploration, and not one in which you are constantly burdened one way or another by what you signify to the wider world. We often talk about the epidemic of mental illness that plagues this university. I would contend that many of these issues are structural, that they relate to the character of the place that we're at, that it's very easy to take for granted to not see how prestige, how privilege, how opportunity occludes from view the very deep, very personal struggles that many of us are contending with, simply trying to negotiate our place of being and belonging. I was going to make a point about our Vice Chancellor and Chancellor of the university. At this point, I feel like my arguments have been well received. So I might just limit myself to one comment about Lord Patton, who, in the light of Rhodes Must Fall, said that students who don't like Rhodes should consider being educated elsewhere. What clearer sign, of course, that this university's leadership does not want you here. The Africa Society invited Lord Patton to debate these ideas. Now, of course, it's worth mentioning, as Patricia did in her talk earlier this afternoon, that African students were far from unified on the question of Rhodes Must Fall. But for Patton to assert something so bluntly, so nakedly, so obliviously, was enough to stoke the consciousness of any number of students who, while not necessarily sympathetic to the specific demands of Rhodes Must Fall, felt that they were entitled to be at this university without having to subscribe to a peculiar form of British jingoism. And of course, Lord Patton, despite being an avid proponent of free speech and debate, declined the invitation to debate the African students. He said that he was going to be busy for the next 6 months, knowing of course full well that the students who invited him would have graduated and moved on. So, as I come to the kind of final part of my reflections, as many of you know, I've recently been appointed to the position of Associate Professor of African Politics with the distinguished honor of succeeding my now late colleague, Professor Raufu Mustapha, the Oxford Department of International Development. Raufu and I attended a conference in Malawi together for the Council for the Development of Social Research in Africa, CODESRIA. And the theme of the conference was marking 25 years since the Kampala Declaration on Academic Freedom in Africa. Here, we listened to and debated with colleagues across universities from all over Africa the questions of what it means to be free as an academic, to write about political issues without fear of imprisonment, to be able to teach students, engage in radical pedagogy, having the adequate resources to do so, to be a young woman navigating an undergraduate degree and be able to take your classes and pass them without having to get what one participant called a sexually transmitted grade from a predatory professor. These are, of course, the realities on the continent and the pressing concerns of what it means to push an agenda for academic freedom where such political, economic, and material realities are restricting and where many pernicious cultures have not been addressed. At the same time, of course, it was invigorating to be in an intellectual and epistemological space that took Africa as its center, that did not have to base its scholarship purely in reference to a Western canon of old white men, and no disrespect to those in the room, who have defined the fields of African history, politics, and anthropology over generations. For me, it does raise a number of questions about where I take my own scholarship. What does it mean now that I've been offered this incredible life opportunity to pursue my own passion as an intellectual, while at the same time trying to retain a distinct identity, trying to push an epistemological agenda that remains faithful to Africa, or at least to some conception of Africa, while at the same time constantly negotiating my own identity and relationship with this institution that I simultaneously love and hate for all the reasons I've already highlighted. I'm reminded yet again, of course, of Walter Rodney's guerrilla intellectual. To be in but not of the university, to retain an ethos and a sense of self-identity and purpose that remains stubborn in its commitment to intellectual rigor, to its politics of decolonization, to its dream of an Africa in all its complexity, diversity, never diminished to simple homogenizing tropes, and never so lacking in self-confidence so as to only be understood from the outside. This is what I'll be reflecting on over the next few months before I formally take my position, and thinking, of course, deeply about my own role as a teacher and as a mentor. Raufu was for many years the patron of the Africa Society. Having been here as a master's student, as a doctoral student, as a lecturer, and now joining the permanent faculty, it remains foremost on my mind how I continue to engage with, to inspire, to challenge, and simultaneously to be humbled by, challenged by, pushed by the African students who come here, who have so much to offer this university, whether or not it recognizes it. And so, I just want to conclude by reiterating my thanks for all that Africa and Africans have given me at this university. It is an honor beyond words to continue to study and to learn and to teach alongside this society and all of the people who've gone before and who come forward in the future, and to hope to be part of revitalizing a new Pan-African dream. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simukai, for opening your hearts to us. And your intervention was, it's perfect to start a conversation, so I'd like to invite the speakers to come forward, and we'll have just 5-10 minutes of questions with moderated by Professor Adebawe.
Yes, thank you very much, Connect. And we have all the speakers here. Okay, let me start by thanking all the speakers for the very wonderful the two sessions we've had today. But before we start the question and answer that I'm supposed to moderate, I think against the backdrop of some of the comments by Simukai, I think it's important to acknowledge the fabulous organizational capacities that have been deployed by the Africa Society to organize the event 2 weeks ago, the Africa Conference, and the event today. As the patron of the association, I am really impressed with the quality of the organization and the delivery of the plans by this association, and I want you all to join me in congratulating the President, Jody, and all the members of the African Society for